Thank you, John. That was great. I like how we start with the Bill O'Reilly style. It's like, do it live. All right. So yeah, I'm really excited that we have a packed room of people here who all want to talk about moving beyond ad hoc automation. Because you've all seen the memes about automating all the things. And then I guess today we're going to talk about what you do next after you've automated all the things. So yeah, my name is Bridget Krumhout. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you're not familiar with the geography of the United States, it's in the middle by the big lakes. I work for Pivotal, and I am on the Cloud Foundry team there. So we're going to be talking a little bit about platforms, though this is not a vendor pitch. And because I don't care if you buy anything, I'm not in sales. And I co-host the podcast Arrested DevOps with Matt Stratton and Trevor Hess. So you can go to arresteddevops.com and listen to us have awesome guests like John Olspa and Catherine Daniels from Etsy and other awesome people talk on our podcast. And I'm also part of the shadowy cabal, the shadowy worldwide cabal that organizes DevOps Days. We're actually neither shadowy nor a cabal, and if you would like to organize a DevOps Days in your city, talk to me, or Patrick Dubois, or any of the other folks who are wandering around here. I think Kareem is here and a couple of other folks. But you didn't come to talk or hear about the obligatory second slide that explains to you why you should be listening to the person who you're like, get on with it, I'm already in the room, I'm already listening to you. And you want to talk about platforms. And they are pretty great. Not the orbiting space platform kind, though that is pretty great too. But just the kind that we operate our software on. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, no, I don't actually use a platform. I mean, you do, right? If you're operating software, if you're deploying and running it in production somewhere, you have some kind of platform. I mean, it might be, artisanally hand-rolled janky bash like we were hearing about from JP in the keynote this morning, but you have a platform. And you're doing something to deploy and scale and monitor and recover from failures. Some of the failures are probably due to datetime libraries, because I got to tell you, it's like the Python datetime library just fills me with sadness at all times. If you're sitting here thinking, okay, I've seen the pizza as a service diagram, but I don't use that platform as a service stuff. I mean, I can't run my site on App Engine or Heroku. Sure, probably, maybe not. But if you are the platform operator for your organization, then you're building something that the developers are pushing code to that maybe is as easy to use as that, maybe slightly less so. I'm thinking when we're figuring between infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, and you're thinking, I'm somewhere in between there. Say you're using, and these slides will be online if you're thinking to yourself, I can't actually read this. Maybe if I take a picture of it and then zoom in, don't worry about it, the slides will be online right after the talk. Sure, say you're using Amazon Web Services, say you're using public cloud, and Amazon's got a whole IaaS thing, and they definitely have a lot of platform components. And you're like, okay, S3 is storage as a service, I'm sort of using that. I think the important thing to consider when you're building whatever it is you're building on top of whatever it is that you're building on top of, whether it's your data center that you're always having cooling problems with, all the way on up to one of the public clouds, putting a lot more thought than you possibly have before into how you're going to construct your platform is probably going to save you getting paged in the middle of the night a lot. I mean, maybe, possibly. So just to take a poll of the room, how many of you consider yourselves developers, shipping features, working on things that your end users are actually, wow, almost no developers in this room. How many people consider yourselves to be in operations? A lot more. There's actually, interestingly enough, a lot of people put themselves in neither of those categories, which I find fascinating. I'm going to actually be talking about this today from an operations point of view. But when you're shipping code or bugs, because at least I don't know about you, but I spend a good long time in operations and submitting pull requests full of infrastructure code that probably had bugs to be peer reviewed by my coworkers and then returning the favor. I think that there's this artificial divide sometimes between, well, I'm shipping features versus I'm working on the infrastructure. But realistically, your infrastructure is an application. Your infrastructure is code that you're shipping. I hope. If it's not, I got to say, this is my plug for, I can't believe I'm having this conversation in 2015, but reliably can talk to people who say, oh yes, we have our server and we configured it and we really hope nothing ever happens to it. And I'm like, oh, this is not going to end well. Because something will happen to it, and that something might be you, I'm just saying. And if you're, whether you're just using some sort of configuration management or taking an image of the machine that you carefully artisanally hand-whittled, or using some kind of higher level thing like Bosch or other things to define your infrastructure. Like, I don't even, writing a whole bunch of bash, I don't even care which one, but please do something so that I can sleep at night. I might not be on call for production infrastructure anymore. Sidebar, I was on call for production infrastructure pretty much nonstop from 1999 to about 2 months ago. So I still have a little bit of post-on-call PTSD sort of thing going on. But for those of you who do wake up in the middle of the night for your infrastructure, please solve those problems before they wake you up. And another sidebar, there's a lot of, I gotta tell you, I got my computer science degree in the 90s. They taught us with Scheme. So there's a lot of cars and could-da-da-da-dars in my discussions here. And so hope you're okay with parentheses. So I live in Minneapolis, middle of the United States. I decided to take a look and see how long it would take to bicycle to our San Francisco office. Answer, way too long. I think this says 165 hours, which I find completely unrealistic, by the way, because I don't know anybody who can bicycle for 165 hours without stopping. I mean, even people in Amsterdam, you're into cycling, but you're not that much into cycling, right? I hope. But the Google Maps felt the need to tell me that there would be a ferry on this route. In big letters, there will be a ferry. I'm like, yeah, okay, sure. You will take the Alameda ferry right at the end. But a lot more significant, I would think, would be the fact that there's, over 2,000 meters or so of elevation change going over the Rocky Mountains. When you're coming up with a roadmap of all of the, and raise your hand if you have a roadmap of improvements you want to make to your infrastructure. It's yeah, a few of you do. Yeah, keep it up if you can't actually ever make progress on that because of fighting fires. Yeah, I see hands that went up that weren't even up before. You're starting to realize what I'm talking about. Which is to say that when you have all of the best intentions, right? At least I know I've had all the best intentions of improving infrastructure, but it's super hard to make forward progress on that when you're constantly reapplying more duct tape to all of the pieces of your infrastructure that you kind of wish you hadn't built that way in the first place, and yet you did, and you kind of end up living with them. So the place that I did this most recently, and if you've seen talks from me before, you may have seen me talk about this place before, but the place I did this most recently was called Drama Fever. It was a streaming video startup. It was much like Netflix, if Netflix were much smaller and mostly Korean soap opera and ran Docker in production. So almost entirely not like Netflix. But we were a 5-person ops team, and 3 of the 5 people were working on, almost full time on building out the platform. And so we were doing it entirely with Docker. And as it turns out, when you have all of the Docker that you can possibly Docker, that still doesn't solve all your problems. I know, it's terrible. But after adding plenty of, Bash and Python, because, Fabric, right? I mean, it's one step above SSH in a for loop, basically, but written in Python, or for orchestration. Or we did actually add some Chef. Adding all of that stuff, yeah, okay, it is possible to operate this stuff in production, yet at some amount of velocity, but it's a lot of work to keep that up and running. And if you're wondering why Drama Fever was using Docker, and I should mention too, because it's probably relevant to this discussion, that they went to Docker in production in October 2013, which was fairly early in the game. And the reason for that was actually around the deployments, because in mid-2013, when starting to deconstruct the monolithic Django Python app into Go microservices, as was the style at the time, it became obvious that the way that they were doing deployments was not going to keep working, right? Because at the time, it was a git checkout and bake an Amazon machine image. Add that to the new launch configuration for the autoscaling group and go. Problem with this is that when you're trying to ship binaries, instead of Python, if you're trying to ship Go binaries, this no longer works. You can't deploy that way. So going to version deployable artifacts necessitated a change in the way the entire platform was orchestrated, but made a lot of sense. And the parts that we were breaking out were like the user bookmarking. Like when people are watching a video and then they pause and then they resume, they would very much like it to be in the same place that they paused. And the image resizing, like on-the-fly image resizing stuff, and also user notifications. More on that later. But let's see. Like in terms of the deployment, though, like being 100% in AWS and using auto-scaling, like it means that doing those checkouts, again, like you still have to have a machine image built, unless what we ended up doing was using the when you're launching AWS instances, you can add something called user data that will Cloud Init will run and will run whatever arbitrary commands you put in there, like when you initially launch the instances. And so that turned out to be the hack for having like a Docker pull down new versions of the container, you know, when like an upstart job ran, as opposed to having whatever was baked on the AMI at the time. So a little bit more composability there. And also the deployments from GitHub were a problem because, like everything else, GitHub occasionally is down. And you don't want your deployments or your CI or everything else like failing just because GitHub is down. So going to Drama Fever, going to Docker in production, like it didn't seem like that great of a risk at the time because Docker was, at the time it was like, oh, well, it's based on LXC. That's a pretty mature container technology. And then, of course, Docker moved to libcontainer. It's probably fine. That is, by the way, the Vasa. You should definitely, if you have not, go watch Pete Cheslock's talk on 17th century shipbuilding and your failed software project. It's amazing. It's very funny. But if you're sometimes when you're making these decisions to like do something like go to Docker in production 2 years ago, it is a risk. Like sometimes you have to take those risks and find out if the payoff is going to be worth it. In Drama Fever's case, it was. Like it made it possible to scale both the Drama Fever site itself and the two other sites Drama Fever is running for AMC, a documentary site and a horror site, like a lot more effectively, while also like spooling out the monolithic, Django Python app into a whole bunch more microservices without a huge amount of overhead for adding them. But again, a little bit of a gamble. And let's see. So a little bit more about the specific implementation of that. Like if you choose to do something like that, a big part of this was creating the version deployable artifacts on Jenkins. So I think a lot of times when people are thinking about using Docker, they have this idealized image in their mind of just a dev does a Docker build and a Docker push on their laptop, and then suddenly somehow that's just YOLO'd out into production. And that's not actually how you want to do this, right? Like you want a little bit more control over the provenance of your images. So you don't want the situation where it's like, oh, your laptop is a super important part of the deployment process. Guess we're going to be taking that and putting it in a rack somewhere. Like that doesn't work. It does. And I feel like the will it blend meme has been replaced with will it scale. And if you're not paying attention in a meeting, by the way, you can always just kind of wake up from that half nap in the afternoon and just say, but will this scale? And it'll be relevant to almost any discussion. But if you're wondering if something is going to scale, like I got to tell you, having people just do a Docker build and then you wonder, what did the Docker file actually look like when they did that? And then you're Docker inspecting and everything is sadness. Like you don't want that. So I would recommend using something in your continuous integration system to produce your images. And if you're thinking at this point, but wait, Bridget, can't you just, Docker pull something from the Docker hub and then Docker run it? And I'm like, if you Docker that into production, I'm just going to revoke your Docker at that point because you have to know what you're putting out there. So like when all of those reports come out that say, but there are so many images on the Docker hub that are full of insecurity, and you're like, yes, and also the internet. You probably shouldn't just curl bash anything into production either. So, but anyway, so that also, by the way, like the way a lot of people use their CI server is to run tests. And even on the Python stuff, we still used it to run tests, but also then to create a version deployable artifact that was the image that had that particular set of, Python or Go or whatever that had been built and tested and known to be good. And this also actually standardized the development process, because instead of a developer being like, well, I just blew up my dev environment, I'm going to be fixing this for half the day. It's like, no, you just Docker pull the container that, or the container image that everybody else is using that just got built off of master, and like you're golden. So, as well as being able to take what's running in production right now, grab that image, sit there and poke at it locally until you find the horrible bugs. Again, containers, not magic, will not solve all your problems, do not actually make the horrible bugs go away. Just saying. But anyway, by the way, I should mention when we're talking about like continuous integration and continuous delivery, like there's a few things in there I want to say, which is that this is actually a pipeline map from Concourse, which is an open source project developed by some engineers at Pivotal. It's freely available. Go take a look at it. And it solves that problem that you get really tired of in Jenkins or GoCD or anything else, which is that multi-stage complicated pipelines are actually a horrible pain to build into your CI system. And Jenkins tells you can't have another post-build action. And you're like, but why? And so if you're fighting against that right now, if you take a look at Concourse, you might like that. But I feel like when people, how many people in this room are using what they would consider to be continuous delivery at some point, like right now? Okay, so a good third of the room at least. How many people think that they're going to get there sometime soon? All right, so maybe another quarter of the people in the room. So I feel like for the places that don't have CD, maybe it's because they don't have any kind of continuous integration environment at all, in which case, try something. There's a lot of CI as a service things out there. You don't have to stand something up on your own. But for the places that feel like they can't because product cares a lot about when features go out and that it's announced, just keep in mind that continuous delivery and continuous deployment are not the same thing. So if you have your code that's working and tested and ready to go out at any given time, you don't actually have to deploy it. You can, but you don't have to. You can still gate your releases, even if you have your code ready to go at any given time. But that makes it so much less terrible if there's something that does need to go out and you're like, but wait, the build is in an untenable state. Oh, you want a hot fix now, but it's Friday and everything is terrible. And it's like, as long as stuff is actually, anything in the hot path that you would need to release from is ready to go, you're going to solve a lot of those problems. That said, Drama Fever did not have what I would consider to be continuous deployment, certainly. Despite having stuff more or less ready to go most of the time, because, trunk-based development or whatever, there were definite, cultural issues of people who really didn't want to use feature flags. It's I think the Night Capital story, made people afraid of dark code, and so they just didn't want to use feature flags. And even hearing that, Etsy used them was not enough to convince people that they were safe or a good idea. So it's yeah, you might be fighting with issues like that. It's hard to change people's minds about that, but I think showing them that having the much smaller batch change to dig through when you're trying to figure out why things went terribly wrong is kind of a good selling point. So speaking of things that people don't necessarily care about / get excited about / want to do, I feel like there's not a lot of leadership if you're not a completely engineering-driven organization. If you don't work for Allspa, you probably don't have management that gets really excited about your deployment process. You're probably pretty excited about it and the improvements you've made with it or the changes you want to make it more possible. But even if other people in your organization don't get excited about the specific process, I think that taking the steps that you need to make it more possible for more people to be involved in it, whether you go so far as Etsy's Deployinator, it's a bot. It can do all the deployments. Or if we had at Drama Fever, the Fabric scripts that we were using for deployment needed somebody's prod AWS credentials. And so we started giving, more prod AWS credentials to developers who were okay with having that. And it does take a certain amount of faith to extend that power outside of, the ops castle, past the moat, et cetera. But I think it's valuable to remember that the benefits you get from your organization of allowing more people to have actual agency in the process, far outstrip the risks. And also, security. I mean, I actually worked at a startup where when I started, I found the master AWS account, like access and secret keys in the all company wiki. And I was like, this isn't going to end well. We're going to be revoking those right now. Because I feel like there is a balance there. So I'm really not advocating like put them in the wiki, but you probably don't need to lock it down. So, only Bridget can do the deploy and she's in Amsterdam. Like that would probably not be a good call. Also, I feel like there's a lot of sidebars and anecdotes here, but I should probably also tell you that if you're going to do canary deployments, and this is a problem that we ran into, because the canary instance was this, carefully hand-whittled server that wasn't in the auto-scaling groups, it ended up with configuration drift away from the ones that were. And there were some places where it did need to be different, to some extent. Like, for example, we were running New Relic on the canary, but not on everything else, because what with the auto-scaling up and down by 10 to 20x, and the way the host pricing was working, like there was no way we were going to run New Relic on everything. But taking the time, later when we started to codify our platform a little bit more and make it a little bit more consistent, taking the time to make sure that there was actually code that defined, and if it's the canary instance, do this, instead of just having the canary instance be totally different, helps a lot. Because like those special Snowflake servers, it's, how they tell novelists you should kill your darlings? Like, I feel like you should, if you have a server where you're worried that if something happens to it, everything will be terrible, like you should just kill it before Murphy's Law does. So it's like something is going to. Ask me later, maybe over drinks, what happens when you remove the Jenkins user's home directory. It's hilarious. Not good. But anyway, so like when we're talking about tech decisions, because I feel like a lot of us are here because we're trying to get more informed, trying to make some decisions around technology. And spoiler alert, I'm not going to give you at the end of this talk a list of all the decisions you should make, because that's not the way it works. But I feel like our decisions aren't always as scientific as we like to believe. So I'm guessing here, you're probably not going to run a Markov bot against the front page of Hacker News and like make all your technology decisions that way. I mean, maybe you are. If you are, please don't tell me. But if you're like me, at least, you're going to be talking to people. You're going to be listening to people's rants, trying to figure out what didn't work for them. MongoDB. Trying to figure out what didn't work well for them. Trying to figure out what paged them all the time. I laughed a lot when Frosty said in the keynote this morning about, you have 99 problems and HBase is most of them. And I'm like, oh yes, I've lived that life. That was fun. Got paged a lot. But I feel like most of your decisions probably are not being made that way. But at the same time, it's disingenuous to say that you're going to do like 100% complete scientific survey of everything out there that exists in the marketplace and maybe like A/B test all of it in production before you decide which one you're going to. Yeah, no. And kind of like Anna Shipman from the GDS team said in her keynote, like they considered waiting for 2 years until there was an answer, and then they realized no, like there isn't going to be an answer in 2 years either. So you do have to decide something. So Andrew Clay Schaefer, who is my boss at Pivotal, actually, has this belief that I think he may be right in, that 90% of tech is tribalism and fashion. And it's like, okay, we want to use the thing that our friends are using. I think that's true, but maybe not for the same reasons as you would think, which is to say that you want to use the things that you're going to be able to get some amount of community support for. And you want to use the things that other people have used and can tell you what their experience with it was like. And you probably don't want to use the thing that hasn't been updated in 3 years and like has 2 stars on GitHub and 15 ignored pull requests. And you're like, if I make that choice, and I could fork that and try to run something great, write something that's better based on it. But if you make that choice, you're not going to have the community support from the open source community that you probably would have from a slightly more solid choice. And so like when we decided to use Chef at Drama Fever, I had used other configuration management tools before and thought they were pretty decent. But a lot of that had to do with community. I know that I can talk to people and get the help that I need if I go down this route that, 2 of our 3 members of the platform team have used before. So I feel like that shouldn't be discounted. That said, just because you have a tool doesn't mean you should do absolutely anything ever with it. One of the terrible mistakes I made when we introduced Chef to our ecosystem is I wanted to chef all the things, because why not? And I'm here to tell you, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So for example, when chefifying our Jenkins server, which was mostly done when the terrible incident occurred, so that helped us recover a lot quicker than we would have. But when chefifying our Jenkins server, I tried to write, a recipe that would install all of the Python wheels that we needed. This turned out to not be a great idea because sometimes things change or move around and the output names are completely unpredictable. And after I wrote a lot of sort of pointless conditional logic, I realized that Chef is not the right tool for this. I was just trying to take a tool that we were using for other things and apply it to the next problem. And it's that was not the right approach. And I think that it's what we were trying to do is build a consistent platform. I mean, even though we weren't really calling it that at the time, but that's what we were doing. And we had an exponential growth in services that needed configuring and managing, and the 3 sites multiplied by 8 or 9 microservices meant that if we were hand editing those user data files that we were feeding into the autoscaling group or the launch configs for the autoscaling groups, there was a great deal of configuration drift. So bringing Chef in to be able to templatize those was definitely the right move. Did it matter that we used that particular tool? Certainly not. But having some way to make that more consistent across our entire infrastructure made a lot of sense. When trying to make this more consistent platform, we had a little bit of, Sturm und Drang. At a place with drama in the name, it maybe doesn't surprise you that we did have some drama inside the team about setting up service standards, just kind of a contract. And some people thought it was about control or personalities, but I like to think of it as being about promises, about the promises that your platform makes to your application and to your application developers. The contract that says, if your application behaves in this way, then you will have these results in production. And I think that's a really powerful thing. I think that if we have, a 12-factor app, we have to also have 12-factor ops. It's we have to have that handshake to say that, within these reasonable constraints, if you log in this way, your logs will appear in Kibana. You will be able to click on them and make pretty pictures. It will be delightful. If you don't log in this way, hey, all bets are off. But I don't think it's putting too much of a restriction on people's freedom to say you need to have your applications behave in a consistent way so that we can make sure to give you consistent monitoring, say, or consistent logging, or consistent performance. If you're, for example, the way Drama Fever was doing the routing and service discovery was pretty simple, actually. It was with Nginx going to certain ELBs on various ports. Okay, so if your application is answering on the expected port, you're going to have a good time. If it's not, you're going to have a bad time. And I think that a lot of times people talk about 12-factor, but they don't think about the responsibilities that puts on your operational environment is you have to honor those contracts and promises. And then everybody will have a better time. And I also think that nothing is ever temporary. When you write that shell script that you just shake your head and you say, this is write-only code and it's terrible, or that Perl script or whatever, and you're this is terrible, I should never do this, I'm doing this now, it's just for now. Nothing is ever temporary because those 1,000-line fab files that we were using for, deployments, we took a little bit of time at one point to modularize them a little bit more. But in general, even though, yes, of course, something that's better would be great, but as ops people in our copious spare time, we're not about to take the time to redo something that more or less worked. I feel like there needs to be an asterisk there, right? On the or less. Because it's It mostly works, mostly. I mean, if it's possible to accidentally put things in the wrong load balancer, then oops. But, and I think that it's, if you can even take the things that you know are terrible and refactor them just into something slightly better, like even if that sounds really, dismal, like there is a market for slightly. It's like you will get some incremental improvements. And I think that's better than just holding out for that big bang, perfect, our platform is now ideal, because it's like, that may never happen. And hey, like, how do you find out if bad things are happening? Like, your monitoring and alerting are probably tightly coupled to the way you've constructed your infrastructure and also to how your application developers are working with it. So, like, do you only find out, do you only add an alert for something after it's gone wrong? Like, I know the airlines do that. It's like, oh, one thing went wrong once. Now we have to take off our shoes forever. But it's like, we probably don't want to treat our operations like that. Like, that's not really ideal. Just to give you an example, again, from Drama Fever, like this is a collection of tools that we were using for monitoring, alerting, logging. If you're looking at the arrows and you're thinking, why do you have an arrow going from CloudWatch to Graphite? Because that makes no sense. Like, it actually does. If you use AWS, you may know that CloudWatch is only good for 2 weeks. So if you want to keep that data and do any kind of, like, I don't know, comparisons over time, or taking a look at the stuff that has been problematic and see if it's not problematic anymore after, n more releases. Like, I would strongly recommend, if you do happen to be using CloudWatch, to make sure to pull the data out of there and put it into your time series data store of choice before it's gone, because you can't get it back once it's gone. And I also think, like, you can't fix what you can't measure. So you have to think about, like, what's your visibility into your operations? So, like, Sure, you want the ability to inject environment variables, for example, that'll control whether something is production or not, just so that you can have fewer points of difference between your production and non-production, infrastructures. But also, like, for the stuff that's in production, or even the stuff that's before production, having the ability for, again, the people who are closest to the code to actually see and understand what the net effect of their work in production is super powerful, super valuable. So, like, one problem that we had at Drama Fever was we set up an Elk stack. Operations loved it. It was fantastic for troubleshooting problems. And the developers weren't using it very much because we didn't take the time to make sure that they understood they could get queries about the things they cared about out of it. And so, like, one enterprising developer actually ended up writing a bunch of queries of, like, oh, are these endpoints still being hit? Because we want to deprecate, like, API v4. And as soon as it became more relevant to the context of these developers, they were a lot more interested in the fact that this tool was available, as opposed to just being a thing nobody ever logged into or looked at. I think James Turnbull makes a really good point when he's talking about monitoring, and he says, like, you're not the customer, or at least not the only customer, of your own monitoring. Like, if you're thinking that your monitoring is just for waking people up in the middle of the night, or is just for, tracking down operational problems, you're missing out on all of the business value and all of the, like, application performance stuff that you would actually get. Let's see. I also think that a lot of people talk about automatic remediation and self-healing, and I think that it's good to a point. But if you have something, and certainly you want to avoid alert fatigue. I mean, burnout in tech is a real problem. If you're being paged 5 times a night, you're probably going to just, want to quit your job and move to some place without internet. I recommend the Northwoods of Minnesota. There's some lovely internet dead zones there. I go there on vacation. If you're, I suspect some of the Northwoods of, Scandinavia might be the same. But if you're trying to make sure that people are going to only be awakened when it actually requires human intervention, that might mean that you had to turn down some of those alerts, or don't turn them on in the first place, but you still want to know about them. And maybe if you have something that's doing automatic remediation, like, that it's a problem. Like, for example, the move from Django 1.4 to 1.7 was not without peril, and it was kind of fraught with misery. And I got to tell you, like, Django Cache Machine is basically sadness as a service. And when trying to rip that out, we ran into, like, all of these. I mean, hey, it was delightful in that it did all this caching for you automatically and you didn't have to think about it. It was less delightful when we started maxing out the throughput on our memcache nodes in Elasticache because of, basically like super hot, super fat keys. So like when we realized that, okay, we have this terrible problem, it's not going to be solved anytime soon. We have a developer trying to fix it full time, but it basically requires redoing the way all of our caching is done. Long story short, we ended up with a cron job that cleared the cache every hour so that we didn't get paged in the middle of the night because the site went down. Because as it turns out, like people watch fewer K-dramas when they're sleeping, but not no K-dramas. Like there's still traffic. So, but anyways, that's an example of something that it's already terrible. We know we don't need to be paged every time it's terrible. And so like the automatic remediation there is probably fine, but I would not recommend just, band-aiding over everything that's terrible and pages you with something that makes it slightly better temporarily if it's just going to come back, unless you know it. You know you're working on it. And also, like, just thinking about the, when you're saying, like alerting is not a Boolean, right? And I'm not saying to send yourself 10,000 emails either, because I filter those emails, and you probably do too, because you can't read them all. But what I would recommend doing is making sure that CloudWatch or New Relic or whatever it is that you're using, put something, if necessary, into your chat of choice. So like, and then you're sitting there thinking, but Bridget, there is no CloudWatch to Slack integration. I looked. That's true, and you can't turn one on because Slack can't do the SNS topic subscription handshake that CloudWatch requires, but you're not doomed because PagerDuty has their different urgency levels now. So if you're using PagerDuty, you don't have to go subscribe to something like Zapier. Like if you're using PagerDuty, you can set a low urgency, no notifications, and route your CloudWatch through PagerDuty to Slack, and it'll totally work because I did it. It made me very happy. So yeah, I would recommend just making sure you're making your alerts sort of visible in a way like that. Something else we did with the CloudWatch alerts at Drama Fever because of the auto scaling is making sure that we weren't using more resources than we needed to, because obviously you're paying Amazon for them. But because we were mostly using Docker to make our deployments more consistent and repeatable and versioned, we were not using application container clustering. So all of the exciting stuff that people are starting to talk about, like with scattering your containers hither and yon, like we weren't doing that. Drama Fever's looking at it now because of that notification server that I was talking about, or that service rather, that I was talking about earlier. Because as it turns out, spinning up an EC2 instance takes a certain amount of time. If you have a spike in your activity where you need more resources, but you need them faster than you actually can spin up an instance, and then the need is gone by the time an instance spins up, like CloudWatch has a 5-minute resolution by default if you don't pay them extra money. I'm not sure how much, probably a lot. But it has a 5-minute resolution by default on the granularity of your metrics. So by the time you're alerting saying, hey, maybe we should spin up some more, oh, no, we really don't even need to spin up any more at this point. And then you have 503s and everything is sadness. So we started looking at application container clustering and quickly realized that, hey, this is actually a bunch more work. It's going to be a lot different than it was, because if the way you have it set up is you expect things will be in a certain security group, and I know, right? You set up a whole bunch of microservices, and if you expect things to be in a certain security group, and you expect things to be talking on certain ports that the security group has access to, but then you set up a heterogeneous, fleet of instances that you're just going to launch all your containers in, and then someone on your team says, but wait a minute, does that mean that we just have to give access to that, which could be anything, to this database server and the cache nodes and everything else? And you're like, yeah, and it's like, oh, that's going to require re-architecting. So it's like, hey, so when you're starting to go to more complex platforms, there's a lot of things you need to think about there. And there's a lot of interesting tools in this ecosystem. Like Drama Fever was starting to look at Mesos and Marathon because the fine folks at Orbitz did some talks where they were showing some really interesting stuff they were doing with that. Obviously, I mentioned earlier I went to Kelsey Hightower's workshop on Kubernetes at OSCON here, and that was really good. There's a lot of stuff out there that can do things like this. What I'm positing, though, is that it's possible that a lot of you are not in the business of building platforms. And even though building platforms is really fun, I spent the last year doing it, and it was great, and I really enjoyed it. And we were a streaming video site, and I had a lot of fun building a platform. And it's possible that if where your efforts can add more business value to your organization, or not even necessarily business, if you're in government, academia, whatever, but if your efforts can add more value to your organization by you working on something else other than reinventing, wheels, ship steering, or otherwise that have already been done. Like there are, for example, and this is not a pitch, so I'm just going to say that yes, I work at Pivotal. Yes, Pivotal has a commercial distribution of Cloud Foundry, but you do not need to buy anything. You can take a look at open source Cloud Foundry for an example. If you want something that does a lot of the container clustering, the automatic remediation, self-healing, monitoring metrics, et cetera, these are pretty well-established patterns by this point. High-functioning organizations have been using a lot of these patterns in one way or another for years. And if you're at the point where you're just starting to build it now, it's possible that you don't need to start where Drama Fever started 2 years ago and start rolling something from scratch. I mean, between various offerings from cloud providers, stuff out of HashiCorp, again, any of these tools that are out there, you might be sitting there thinking to yourself, yes, but which one should I use? The answer is, seriously, it depends, because a lot of these things you can't put them in a matrix and say, they all cover, this much of it, basically. And so it's again, something that's more structured, like Cloud Foundry, covers a lot of it. However, even Cloud Foundry is not perfect, doesn't do everything. So considering what your needs are and what your workloads look like, if you watch Astrid Atkinson's keynote from Velocity Santa Clara this year, she's worked at Google for a decade. She's a director of search, and her talk was about engineering for the long game. And she pointed out, I think quite rightly, that Google didn't sit down 10 years ago and design what they have today. They got there incrementally. And so instead of saying, I've already started Dockering all of the Docker, but now which of these other various things do I need to add? Think to yourself, what do I need to do now and in the near to distant future, but not what I need 2 years from now, because that's way too far in the future to even worry about. Andrew had this, and I don't know if you can read the small print in the back, so I'm just going to read it to you, but Andrew had this, I thought, kind of useful infographic to kind of explain the difference between structured and unstructured platforms. And I don't think that everybody wants to start from 2x4s. Kelsey Hightower's retort on Twitter was hilarious, because he was like, but Kubernetes is more like you have, 10 different ladders. I'm like, oh, Kelsey, you're making Andrew's point for him. Which is to say that a lot of people want to push an application and not spend a lot of time building a platform to do it on. And if so, you might want something more structured. If, on the other hand, you want to spend a lot of time building a platform, there are a lot of really great open source building blocks out there and open source projects that you can take, look at, contribute to. We would love to have you contribute to Cloud Foundry. So I think that there's a lot of pieces here. And probably what I want to leave you with is the US Digital Services has a section called 18F that does, a lot of new projects specifically, but not as much forklifting of old stuff, but a lot of new projects for government. And they recently decided to use open source Cloud Foundry to set up their cloud, because their platform as a service for developers inside government, because the way they saw it, having people reinvent all of the infrastructure bits every time in every department across an entire organization is a lot of wasted effort. And so if inside your organization, there's a lot of different solutions that are kind of coming to bear, and you really want your pet solution and somebody else wants one that starts with, a different letter K or M or, whatever, make your peace with each other and build something together. A lot of those pieces that you want to use for resume-driven development or conference-driven development can be used together. So use one platform and not more than one, and you're gonna make a lot more value for your organization. And then contribute some open source back, because then you'll make more value for all of us. So yeah, that's my pitch. All right, thank you. And I think I'm out of time. Yes. I think I will answer questions in the hallway. It will be delightful. Thank you so much.